The most powerful thing, I think, for narratives is the multiplicity of the voices, and not just the voices themselves, but where those voices come from. Things like Lord Kitchener, when he steps off the Windrush, and you hear his pride in landing in London as he sings, "London is the place for me, London, this great city."
For me, narratives are stories which people use to do all sorts of different things. And if you are trying to analyze what something means, you have to think, well, why is this person telling this story to me at this time? What is this story doing here now?
I would say that narratives are patterns of signs that build meaning. And those can be signs that are sound signs or written verbal signs or images, still or moving images. Chidam Essen and myself and the artist Shyla Berman did some work on visual autobiographies in East London. And that involved looking at the kind of pictorial representations of people's lives that they made in East London, and looking at the build-up exactly of meaning within images.
We are persuaded by stories in our everyday life all the time. From the moment that we're able to make meaning, when people, if we're lucky enough, are reading us stories, telling us stories, we learn early to make sense of the world through stories. And political narratives are no different. The way in which we can remember the meaning of something is through a story.
The imagination is a very important, I want to say, muscle, really. We need to use this narrative imagination to be able to both revisit and try to understand the past, so that you actually look at the present moment as being only one of a number of possibilities of things that could have happened. And I think that as political psychologists, it's very, very important for us to try to understand how the present inflects our understanding of the past, but also very much our visions for what kinds of futures we think we're moving towards. In all sorts of political movements that you'll see, anti-immigrant movements, they're all about some, imagined, feared future, okay? And I think that to try to understand how these movements grow, or to look at the appeal of Brexit, and you look at some imaginary past, right? In order to understand how these things come to be, you have to consider the role of the imagination. The Center for Narrative Research, we founded in 1999. Corinne and I were co-teaching on an undergraduate module of life histories. And there was, of course, at that time, a very significant turn to narrative in the social sciences.
We developed a research centre around narratives because it offered a clear possibility to work interdisciplinarily. A lot of us were also working on issues around representation. So we wanted to do something that would draw in people that were interested in representational issues in that sense.
CNR in many ways takes up this idea of epistemic closure, to my mind, because it essentially tries to work with narrative psychology as a way of bridging the gap, as a way of telling the stories of people who would not ordinarily come together.
The role that CNR played in the development of narrative approaches was absolutely central.
Other such centers have emerged and have supplemented its work. I don't know that any of these would have emerged had the CNR not paved the way. More to the point still, I don't know that the very field of narrative research itself would have emerged and flourished as it has without the groundbreaking efforts of Molly, Corinne, and others at the CNR.
We take multiple positions when we have narratives to tell and when we know that there are others to hear those narratives. None of these positions are unique. We, tellers and listeners, use them to make the narrative make sense. All of these positions come together to create a relationship where narratives emerge if they do. Yes, it's a relationship. CNR has been a space where I found out that relationship.
When Homi Bhabha talks about the right to narrate, I think what he points to very interestingly is that this right is a necessary but not a sufficient right, so that you can think about narration as a kind of route to narrative citizenship. There are lots of different approaches to narrative methods, using interviews, using observations, using written materials, using visual materials. Perhaps most importantly would be how you involve or work with the participants on those methods. If really the right to narrate is an essential right, then these methods should be the participants' methods also.
I tend to interview people about their lives and have very long conversations with people, and sometimes those conversations have existed over years. My work in East Germany, those conversations are, 30 years old now. So, and we are still in conversation. In 1989, as I was finishing my PhD, the world was busy erupting. And I happened to be based in Cambridge, England, which was a place where many of the leaders of these Eastern European revolutions were coming. And I happened to be in an audience listening to Jens Reich, who was one of the only English-speaking dissidents. I was absolutely fascinated by this guy. I just thought, what happens to political commitment when the state that you are fighting against actually dissolves? And it took me about 2 years to piecemeal together some kind of approach that allowed me to spend 6 months in Berlin, interviewing about 40 people who were, by and large, anti-state activists about the revolution that had happened. I thought I was going to be interviewing them about this, dissidents movement that had happened, and what did they think about what had happened to these particular issues that they were fighting for. In fact, what I found is that people just wanted to talk about the Stasi and people spying on each other and finding out that your spouse was doing this or your neighbor was doing this. And the topic of political forgiveness really entered my life in a big and unexpected way at that point.
The issue of silence in narratives, I think, is really interesting, partly because it's never really a silence. Unless you're in a vacuum, there's not a silence. There's some sound there. When we were doing some work in Calais with the filmmaker Bhavesh Hundocha, who's part of the company Loud Minority, he made a really nice film called Who Opens a School? And that film doesn't really have a lot of sound in various places. It seems like it's just filming some images from the camp, but you can hear things nevertheless, and particularly you can hear the wind rushing over the camp. At times you can hear some children's voices, but particularly you hear this sound of the air. And I think what's interesting about that is that this is a place where, in a sense, people have been erased. Even when they were there, they were erased. When you're talking to people, actually talking, and they're silent, I think it's pretty important to let people be silent. Many people have recognized the violence of dragging people's stories out of them. Derrida's written about that very evocatively, I think. Or indeed asking people to tell stories that are a kind of silence in themselves. There are certain kinds of routine stories that are expected from people. So if you are a refugee, certainly. There's a certain story that you need to tell. And is that really a story? Is that more of a silence, perhaps? It's the story that you have to tell. I think it's very important to think about the constraints that lead people either to speak or not speak, rather than necessarily to focus on whether it's speech or silence.
I would say that dialogue is an absolutely essential component of narrative. If you spend time listening to people telling stories about their lives, they are always communicating to you about who they think has power, who doesn't, who is silenced, who is able to speak, who sets the rules, what is fair, how you contest what is not fair. These really fundamental political questions are in the DNA of people as we live. So I think that narratives must be part of public dialogue. These are sort of two arms of the same body, in a sense. And I think that narrative psychology demands that we really try to take another party's point of view seriously. That also involves, of course, narrative imagination.
Because of the nature of our story lives, and because people communicate and connect with each other through their own personal histories, through their own personal kind of experiences that are told in a narrative form, politically they can situate themselves within the structures of society.
I think political narratives are really persuasive because in many ways they provide for us an anchor. And it's generative in that sense. They provide for us a sense of meaning in terms of our lives, but also in relation to who we are with others.
You have some very skillful people who knowingly employ political narratives to do certain things. And one of the most skilled at that was, for instance, Barack Obama. Barack Obama was an extremely effective narrative president. And I think that when he was trying to get people on side, he would always do so in a storied way. The Association for Narrative Research and Practice has come out of the more than 20-year existence of the Center for Narrative Research. What we will do going forward is an exciting challenge.
It brings together academics and practitioners and artists.
I'm really excited to be involved in ANRP because I see great opportunities in working independently, coming out of a university setting and seeing what can be done in terms of practice and in terms of bringing together different kinds of actors within narrative research and narrative work. In many ways, we're free to do that. We're free to imagine different kinds of structures and collaborations.
It provides a platform where scholars, practitioners, and other interested parties or stakeholders within the field or area of narrative research will share and exchange information. But more importantly, is the extension of the global South, global North, leveraging that brings together people from different backgrounds.
I think that narrative scholars have a challenge in front of us in this post-truth age. Narrative scholars need to actually frame our interest in subjective truths in the wider context that some things are, of course, objective and verifiable. And in contrast to Kellyanne Conway talking about alternative facts, that some things are not really up for debate.
You could say that the rise of right-wing populist movements and the resistance to them, the environmental crisis, the post-colonial or the neoliberal condition, Black Lives Matter, state measures during the pandemic, and the protests that we have seen against those can be looked at as a struggle of narratives. narratives struggling for legitimacy of certain knowledge that is expressed.
What narratives do, if we think about narratives as explanations, they extend the context. One narrative generates another narrative and becomes a broader account. So in a broader account, it becomes possible to see why something that's a lie becomes a truth for somebody. So I think that that's probably quite important. Rather than simply countering lies, actually generating narratives that counteract the disinformation, and counteract the disinformation by generating a broader truth.